wind was tearing at the shores of Jorvik with an uncontrollable fury, a winter storm that seemed unwilling to let up. The city was accustomed to harsh weather, with overcast skies and the sun hidden behind thick layers of clouds. But that morning, the wind was not the only thing cutting spirits. News of the death of Erik Håkansson, Jorvik's youngest and most charismatic leader, had spread like wildfire, setting hearts and minds ablaze. Jorvik was one of the greatest cities of the Vikings, famed for its military might, its long raiding voyages, and the greatness of its kings. But the death of Hakon's son Erik was about to bring a darker truth to light. The future of the city was at stake, and a new leader would need to step up to the plate. But who could replace Erik, whose charisma and combat skills were so unmatched? Ragnar Håkansson, Erik's older brother, was not the chosen one, nor the preferred one. He was a warrior who stood in his brother's shadow. While Erik led the city and the troops on their expeditions, Ragnar stood out only for his strength on the battlefield. However, when Erik fell, fatally wounded by a Saxon spear, Ragnar found himself with a responsibility he never wanted. Erik's blood was still fresh on the stones of the battlefield, and the echoes of the war cries seemed to fade, but the tragedy was only beginning. Ragnar knew that now, more than ever, Jorvik needed a leader. He was not the ideal man for it, but the circumstances left him no other choice. With the pain of losing his brother and the weight of a crushing legacy on his shoulders, Ragnar found himself faced with a dilemma: follow in Erik's footsteps, or abandon everything and lose himself in the darkness of the mountains. But Jorvik could not be left to the mercy of weakness or hesitation. The city needed strong leadership, and as much as Ragnar doubted his abilities, he could not turn his back on the fate that awaited him. The council chamber was filled with piercing eyes, old warriors and clan leaders yearning for answers. Ragnar Håkansson felt smaller than ever, and he was surrounded by voices questioning his abilities. He did not have Erik's presence, nor the natural confidence of the other leaders. The words of his father, Hakon, still echoed in his mind, reminding him of the weight of the crown he had never wanted to carry. The counselors began to debate, as they always did. Voices mingled, some desperate, others cynical. The city needed a leader, but Ragnar's choice did not seem natural. Bjorn, the army commander and an old friend of his father, was the first to speak out against his leadership. Ragnar, Bjorn said with a dry laugh, this is no time to hesitate. Jorvik needs a strong leader, someone who can fight like Erik, someone who can keep the city safe. You, Erik's brother, are no more than a warrior, a man of the sword, not of politics. Ragnar felt the weight of the words, though he knew they were not entirely false. He was not a leader of grand speeches, nor did he have Erik's talent for diplomacy. But the life of a Viking was not based solely on the ability to rule, but on the strength and courage to act in times of crisis. And now, more than ever, Ragnar knew it was time to act. The council, divided, finally fell silent. In silence, they looked to Ragnar, waiting for his answer. Jorvik will be protected, he said, his voice hoarse. No matter what they say, I will do whatever it takes to keep our land safe. If my sword is what it takes, that is what I will fight with. The decision had been made, but that didn't mean it would be easy. Ragnar knew that by being proclaimed leader of Jorvik, he would face challenges he had never imagined. The greatest of these would not come from the Saxons or from external enemies, but from within his own city. Ragnar began to prepare the defense of Jorvik, knowing that the Saxons would not give up easily. The council was divided, and internal factions were growing. Some Viking clan leaders questioned Ragnar's authority, and this only increased the fear of a possible internal rebellion. Jorvik might be the jewel of the north, but without unity, the city would be lost. Ragnar knew this better than anyone. Meanwhile, the city was preparing for the next raid. The Saxons, relentless as ever, were becoming bolder. The enemy fleet was approaching the shores of Jorvik, and tension was in the air. Ragnar was everywhere at once, coordinating preparations, reviewing defense plans, and trying to keep his warriors' morale high. The weight of leadership could not be more evident. But amidst all this, Ragnar could not take his eyes off Bjorn. Something about him bothered him. Ragnar felt that the commander of the army was not completely loyal, as he should be. Something is not right, Ragnar thought as he watched Bjorn commanding the troops, his gaze too focused on his own glory. The commander seemed more concerned with his image than with the survival of Jorvik. The dilemma was clear. Ragnar had the Saxons and external enemies to worry about, but Bjorn's internal treachery seemed an even more imminent danger. Time was against Ragnar. The wind promised a storm, but not just on the choppy waters surrounding Jorvik. Within the city, something more insidious was moving in the shadows. As preparations for battle against the Saxons intensified, Ragnar could not ignore the signs that were emerging around Bjorn. His eyes were cold and calculating, as if he were just waiting for the right moment to strike a fatal blow. Ragnar took a moment away from the hustle and bustle of the battlefield, and in the evening he made his way to the hall of Leif, his war strategist and loyal friend. Leif, with his sharp mind and always one step ahead, was quick to notice the growing tension in Ragnar. "You're thinking the same thing I am, aren't you?" Leif asked, his expression grave. Ragnar didn't answer right away. He knew better than to be hasty, but the evidence was mounting. "Do you trust Bjorn?" Ragnar asked, his gaze fixed on the flames burning in the fireplace. Leif hesitated before answering. Bjorn has been a loyal ally, but it's hard to ignore the change that's come over him. He seems more interested in personal power than the good of Jorvik. If you ask me, something's wrong. Ragnar felt a chill run down his spine. He knew Leif was right. Bjorn was no longer the man he knew. His actions, his words, his looks, everything pointed to impending betrayal. But Ragnar couldn't act without solid evidence. He needed a clue, something that would prove that the commander was in league with the Saxons. That night, Ragnar made a risky decision. He summoned some of his most trusted warriors and began a secret investigation. As preparations for battle continued, Ragnar knew he had to dig deeper, to find out the truth about Bjorn before it was too late. If Bjorn was truly betraying Jorvik, the city was in grave danger. Ragnar and his men, under cover of night, infiltrated the areas where Bjorn spent most of his time, searching for any clues that might confirm their suspicions. The streets were empty, and the silence that hung over Jorvik seemed to portend something dire. Ragnar did not know what he would find, but he knew it was worth the risk. Finally, in a small warehouse on the outskirts of the city, they found what they were looking for. On a simple wooden table was a detailed map of Jorvik's defenses, with markings indicating weak points, areas where the Saxons could most easily attack. But the most telling thing was what was written on a letter, barely visible among the documents. The letter, written in Bjorn's hand, was a deal with the Saxons. He was negotiating the surrender of Jorvik in exchange for power, an alliance that would put the city in the hands of the invaders. Ragnar's anger grew like a raging flame. The betrayal was there, written in clear words, and the man he trusted most was trying to destroy everything he had sworn to protect. With the letter in hand, Ragnar and his warriors returned to the council hall. The mood in the city was tense. The battle against the Saxons was approaching. But now, Ragnar knew he had to make a decision. The weight of leadership had never been greater. Ragnar, with the map and the letter in hand, headed straight for Bjorn's room, the man who had been his friend and mentor, but who now posed a deadly threat. Leif and Fridas accompanied him, both with dark looks on their faces, knowing that what was about to come would change everything. When Ragnar entered Bjorn's room, the commander was standing, as if he had already known something was about to happen. His gaze did not waver when he saw the letter in Ragnar's hand. "I knew this would happen," Bjorn said with an unnerving calm. "You are like your father, Ragnar, always believing that what is right is the only way. But the world is not like that anymore. Power is not won with honor and glory. Power is taken. I took it." Bjorn's words cut like a sharp blade, but Ragnar did not hesitate. "Jorvik will not be yours," he said in a firm voice. "You have betrayed everything we stand for, and your ambition will destroy us." The fight between Ragnar and Bjorn was inevitable. Swords clashed with metallic sound, and the duel between the two men was fierce, each fighting for his own convictions. Ragnar, with his brute strength and experience, finally overcame Bjorn, driving the blade of his axe into the chest of the traitorous commander. "You did not succeed, Bjorn," Ragnar muttered, looking down at the fallen body of his former friend. "But Jorvik will stand." With Bjorn dead, the future of Jorvik was once again in his hands. But the victory tasted bitter, for he knew there was still a greater battle to be fought. the fight against the Saxons, who now knew of his internal weakness. The victory over Bjorn was bitter, but necessary. Ragnar knew that although treachery had been eliminated, the real battle was yet to come. With the city of Jorvik on alert, their enemies, the Saxons, were preparing for the final assault. They knew of Bjorn's death and probably of all the internal turmoil the city had endured. But Ragnar also knew that the Saxons were nothing more than a necessary evil, something that Jorvik would always face, like the biting wind from the north. The city was ablaze with preparation. Ragnar gathered his men, organized his defenses, and studied every weak point in Jorvik's walls. Now more vulnerable than ever, Leif was at his side, always with strategic plans to repel the invaders, while Freydis trained her warriors tirelessly, preparing them for the battle to come. They knew the odds were slim, but there was no choice. Jorvik would have to hold out, and they would be the last line of defense. Freydis stepped closer to Ragnar as he studied the map of the defenses. "The city is prepared to hold out," she said, her voice grave. "But what about you? Your mind is fractured, Ragnar. The weight of your leadership and the loss of Eric. It could affect you in the battle." Ragnar looked at her, the pain and suffering visible in his eyes. "I know what's at stake, Freydis, but Eric's death, Bjorn's betrayal, it's all made me stronger. I can't fail now. Not for him, not for Jorvik." Freydis hesitated, then placed a hand on Ragnar's shoulder. "Remember, you're not alone. We all stand with you." Those words echoed in Ragnar's mind as he watched the city prepare for the worst. He knew there was no more time for hesitation. The battle was about to begin. The early morning was marked by a tense silence. The walls of Jorvik were reinforced. The main gates were locked, and the warriors were posted in strategic positions. The city was ready, but fear was in the air. The Saxon siege was imminent, and no one knew how long the walls would hold. Ragnar, at his command post, watched the horizon. He knew the Saxons were approaching. The smoke rising on the horizon indicated the advance of their armies, preparing to besiege Jorvik and subjugate the city. Ragnar turned and looked at his men, at those who would fight by his side, those who had already sworn their loyalty. "We will not let them take what is ours from us," he said, his voice strong and clear, echoing off the walls of the hall. "Jorvik lives because we make it live. And for that, we will fight to the last man, to the last breath." Leif and Freydis stood at his side, their gazes firm and resolute. They knew what Ragnar was saying was true. This would be the city's last defense. If they failed, Jorvik would fall. The next few hours were marked by intense preparations. The Saxon army approached, and soon the first signs of the siege began to show. The sound of drums echoed outside, and the ground shook with the approach of the enemy. The sentries began to shout, warning of the approaching invaders. Ragnar gave the order: "Prepare for battle. The wall must hold, and the city must stand." The clash between the two armies was violent. The Saxons attacked with ferocity, their catapults firing stones and heavy arrows at the walls of Jorvik. But the Viking warriors, led by Ragnar, resisted. With axes and swords, they repelled the invaders, keeping the gates closed and preventing the advance of the enemy troops. However, the strength of the Saxons was immense. The hours of fighting turned into a test of endurance, where every corner of the city seemed to be the target of a relentless attack. Ragnar, sword in hand, fought with uncontrolled fury, as if each blow were an attempt to avenge Eric's death and Bjorn's betrayal. Leif, the strategist, was at Ragnar's side the whole time, guiding the attacks and helping to defend the gaps that were beginning to appear in the walls. Freydis, with her fierce strength, cut through enemies with precision, each blow a promise of revenge against the Saxons. But the battle was far from over. The Saxons, realizing the difficulties, began to organize for a heavier siege. Ragnar knew that he could not continue like this for much longer. He needed to act quickly or Jorvik would fall. Dawn brought with it the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Ragnar looked at his men, now exhausted and wounded, but with a flame of resistance still in their eyes. He knew the city could not hold out much longer. The siege was tightening, and the Saxons were more determined than ever. The enemy leader, a man named Alaric, knew that the only way to secure victory was to crush the heart of Jorvik. Ragnar gathered his top commanders, including Leif and Freydis. The city will not withstand another direct attack. We must fight the enemy's strength from within if we are to have any chance of surviving. Leaf nodded. I have a plan, but it will be risky. We must attack the weak points in the enemy lines and cut off the supply of reinforcements. Fridas, with a determined look on her face, said, My best warriors and I will follow in a flanking manner. If we can weaken the enemy line, we can buy time. Ragnar, weighing the stakes, agreed, do whatever it takes. Jorvik must live. With their strategy in mind, Ragnar and his commanders set out for the battlefield once more. The Saxon siege was at its height, but with courage and blood, the Vikings fought to fend off the threat. The sound of iron clashing against iron, the war cries, and the weight of sacrifice were present in every second of the battle. As the fighting intensified, Ragnar found himself facing the Saxon leader, Alaric. He knew this was his last chance to save the city, and with one deadly blow, Ragnar defeated Alaric, breaking through the enemy lines. The battle was won, but the cost was high. The battle was over, but the victory did not bring the joy that had been expected. Jorvik was devastated. The blood of its warriors covered the ground and the walls. The houses had been destroyed, and the echoes of pain and loss were in every corner. Ragnar, exhausted and covered in wounds, looked at the city with a mixture of relief and sadness. The battle had been won, but the cost had been immense. He knew that the city would never be the same. The Saxons were retreating, but victory did not mean peace. Ragnar looked at the fallen bodies, both of the invaders and of his own men, and the pain seemed unbearable. Eric, he whispered, the memory of his brother taking over his thoughts. You would have been here to see all this. You should have been here. Leif, who was approaching Ragnar with a somber expression, placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. You did what had to be done. Ragnar, Jorvik still lives. Eric will be proud of you. Fridas, also scarred by the battle, approached. Her face was covered in blood and dirt, but her eyes showed a mixture of respect and compassion for Ragnar. You are not alone, Ragnar. Jorvik survives because of you, because of your strength. Ragnar, though grateful to have his friends by his side, felt the weight of loss weigh even more heavily on his shoulders. The city was still standing, but how would it continue after everything that had happened? He did not have all the answers, but he knew he could not rest. Now, more than ever, he needed to protect what was left of Jorvik and ensure that the legacy of his brother Eric and that of his father Hakon would live on. In the days following the battle, Jorvik slowly began to rebuild. The wounded were cared for, the destroyed buildings were rebuilt, and the people, though tired and worn, gathered around the flames of their fires, keeping the flame of hope alive. But for Ragnar, the burden had never been greater. He was surrounded by advisors and local leaders, discussing the measures needed to ensure the city's long-term survival. Jorvik still faced a constant threat from invaders and rival clans, and his authority needed to be consolidated. But as he spent his days trying to rebuild the city, his mind was elsewhere. Ragnar felt that, despite his victory, something was breaking inside him. The responsibility of leading his city weighed like a mountain on his shoulders. He missed his brother, the trust Eric had instilled in everyone around him. But now, as leader, Ragnar had to carry the weight of Jorvik alone. On a silent night, after another long day of discussions about the city's future, Ragnar retired to the empty hall. He looked at his family's old tapestries, at the war trophies his father and brother had won, and loneliness enveloped him. He sat down on a bench, let his thoughts take over his mind. Eric's emptiness, Bjorn's betrayal, the war against the Saxons, all of it was building up inside him, leaving him without the strength to continue. It was there in that solitude that Ragnar felt like he had lost himself. He was no longer the warrior who followed orders, the brother who hid in the shadows of Eric's legacy. Now, he was a leader, the man who would shape the future of Jorvik. But he no longer knew who he was. The man who had gone into battle with a clear mission no longer existed. The weight of responsibility, the pain of loss, and the distrust he felt towards himself had consumed him. But amidst the darkness, a soft voice called him back to reality. It was Leif, who had approached silently. Ragnar, Jorvik needs you, not just as a leader, but as the man you are. We don't need a ghost from the past. We need a future, and that future depends on you. Those words cut through the silence of the night like a sharp blade. Ragnar looked at Leif, feeling a flame of determination begin to ignite within him again. "You're right," Ragnar said with a slight, bitter smile. "Jorvik lives, and I have a responsibility to ensure that it continues to live." Leif nodded, understanding the weight of the moment. "You're not your brother, Ragnar, but you're the best chance Jorvik has right now. Don't forget that." The following days were spent rebuilding, but also reflecting. Ragnar began to realize that despite the losses and betrayals, he still had a purpose. He couldn't be Eric, but he could be the best leader Jorvik ever needed. He began to learn to rule, to make difficult decisions, and to accept that as a leader he couldn't please everyone. But he also understood that Jorvik's strength lay not only in swords and shields, but in the unity of its people. The external tensions eased. The Saxons withdrew for a time, and the rival factions within the city began to recognize Ragnar's strength and leadership. He had survived the greatest test of his life, and so had Jorvik. But he knew the road ahead would be long. The world was changing, and threats were new every year. But somehow Ragnar felt that, while the weight of loss would never lift, he was beginning to accept his role. He would be Jorvik's shield, the city's last offender, until his last breath. And with that determination, Ragnar Håkonsson looked at the horizon, knowing that the city of Jorvik, its people, and its legacy would not be forgotten. The story of their struggle, their pain, and their victory would become a legend that would be passed down from generation to generation. And this is the story of Ragnar Håkonsson, the last shield of Jorvik. He was not the leader he chose to be, but the one fate imposed on him, the man who lived in the shadow of his brother, but who, in the face of tragedy and betrayal, found his true strength. Ragnar was not forged in words and promises, but in battles and sacrifices, in the weight of a crown he never wanted, but accepted with courage. Jorvik survived, not because its walls were impenetrable, nor because its warriors were invincible, but because the spirit of its people was never broken. And it was through strength, pain, and loyalty that Ragnar Håkonsson, with his sword in his heart, made the city reborn. His story will become legend, not only among the Vikings, but among all those who believe that, even in the darkest hours, it is possible to find the light to move forward. And so, as the north wind continued to blow, the story of Jorvik and its last great leader would echo through generations, as a reminder that a man's legacy is made not only by the victories he wins, but by the choices he makes in the face of loss, betrayal, and pain. The story of Ragnar Håkonsson is not just about a warrior. It is about the constant fight for honor, survival, and what is most valuable, the unconditional love for his people. And so ends the saga of Jorvik's last shield. But his name, his honor, and his courage will live forever in the songs, memories, and hearts of all who once called Jorvik home. Did you like this story? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next epic sagas. The journey continues.